Hey everyone, Jared here from Offsite. So excited to have you with us. We're going to jump straight into it, introduce you to Jenny, Adam, and Jake, and I'll let them introduce themselves real quick. So if you guys want to share, who you are, what you're working on, and then your favorite offsite location in the world, that could be our little icebreaker for this webinar. Then we'll jump into the questions. But ladies first, Jenny, I'll give you the spotlight. Feel free
Gotcha.
to introduce yourself.
Thanks. I think I'm unmuted. Yes. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Sauer-Klein. I am the founder and director of the Culture Conference. We're an invite-only event for organizational leaders about transforming ourselves and our culture from the inside out. So we're part personal growth, part professional development, because my experience is that they work hand in hand and you can't really have one without the other. And then I also have another business called The Primary Shift, and we design engaging, interactive employee experiences. And so that's a little bit about my world. Offsite location. Let's go to Hawaii. I mean, why not? That would be my pick. And I'm gonna pass it over to Adam.
Great, thank you. My name is Adam Cebulski. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Transform Forward. We help organizations navigate change, build stronger teams, and develop strategies that drive long-term success. We have three primary functions. What first is strategy consulting, executive coaching, which includes team development, as well as training and facilitation. So we work with lots of teams to build their leadership teams, develop their organizational culture, and really assess that organizational culture. As far as an offsite location, I can't pick any other place but our own backyard in the mountains of Colorado. There's no better place than just sort of getting away, and you can't beat the landscape.
Good answer.
Agreed. There was one called Zapata Ranch that we used to work with that looked beautiful, and we were about to go to it, and then they closed, and I was sad. But that's okay. We'll chat about that in a second. Hi, everyone. I'm Jake. I'm the head of sales here at Offsite. Prior to this role, though, I was chief of staff of a nuclear fusion startup, which is very ironic because my degree is actually in tuba, is what I say as a joke, but it's technically music education. So I went from being a music educator to running multiple nonprofits to then working luxury hospitality to now being chief of staff, and then now here at Offsite. And so basically my background is sort of how do we get communities together, get them excited, get them engaged, and then get them motivated to really change the world in some way, shape, or form. And so that's why I love working here at Offsite, because I can not only get to do that for our team here at Offsite, but also get to work with all of our incredible clients to help them do the same as well. So that's why I'm here chatting with you today.
Dream offsite location.
Oh, yes. I'm going to say Lisbon, which is sort of one of our more popular destinations, but I have not gotten to go there yet. So I'm really excited to hopefully get to do that because the activities look wonderful. So excited for that.
And when I answer the question for myself, I like to envision that we have a repossessed Russian super yacht or a super yacht that belonged to a Russian oligarch that was repossessed. And then we're flying our team in, private jets, helicopters to the super yacht. And then we use that for our offsite for, 3 to 5 days. That would be dream offsite location. But I'm being a little silly. But we are not going to be silly for this webinar. We're going to be all business here. I want to make sure you get as much value as possible in the hour or so. And so I wanted to give it to the panel. What would you say are the basics of having exceptional company culture when you're on a remote or hybrid team? Uh, I'll just leave it at that. Like, what are the fundamentals that we got to nail? And then we can always get into advanced tactics and Q&A at the end for those that are joining live.
So one of the things we always talk about is, especially for remote or hybrid teams, but even for in-person teams, is there has to be a level of intentionality. So you can't just assume that culture is going to happen. And oftentimes when you just let culture happen, it's probably not going to be the culture that you want it to be. And so thinking about, as an organization, what are your espoused values? What are you hoping that people are exhibiting in terms of positive behaviors? And how are you letting them know and reinforcing those behaviors so that it becomes part of your culture? We talk a lot about building expectations, traditions, and norms for your culture. And so really thinking about, you have to be able to have conversations to define those and figure out, what does that actually look like in practice?
We're off to a good start.
Yeah, I would say in many ways, I always think the beginning of anything is one of the most important opportunities that you have to establish, like you said, Adam, like norms and traditions and culture. And so when I look at what is the beginning of a role, what does the onboarding program look like? And I have 3 principles of connection that I talk about in my work because I feel like connection is such an important piece of what people are getting out of work and what they need in order to be successful, right? So when we look at Project Aristotle that Google did, around really one of the keys to high performing teams is psychological safety. And part of how we create psychological safety is that feeling of connection, that feeling of like, I can ask for help. It's okay to make mistakes. Like we're all learning here. And so I feel like in the beginning of any experience or any role is a primary opportunity to really establish that connection and that psychological safety. So those 3 connection principles are connect early, connect often, and gradually increase vulnerability. So connecting early, your onboarding program is one of the best ways you can do that. Connecting often, making sure that every time your team has a meeting or an offsite that you're prioritizing connection, and gradually increasing vulnerability is not asking people to reveal too much too soon, but meeting them where they're at and then inviting them to share more in a way that's reasonable and appropriate in a professional setting. So I think especially when you're in a situation where you're in a remote team or a hybrid team where maybe you've never met your coworkers in person, you have to be like Adam was saying, like really intentional and strategic about how you develop those relationships, because if you don't create that time and space for people to connect and make meaningful connections amongst themselves, like it's not going to happen by chance. It has to happen strategically and intentionally. So creating those moments for icebreakers, for team building, for bonding, for meaningful collaboration is really crucial when they're not together in an in-person thing, where in person you're often having those serendipitous moments of connection, but in hybrid and remote teams, that's much less likely and harder to do. So it has to be strategic, it has to be facilitated, and it has to be consistent in order to really build the culture over time.
Jake, you got anything to add here?
I mean, but you kind of took a combination of what I was thinking as well. I think for me, we have a value here at Offsite of radical candor. And whenever I'm onboarding someone to my team, I also add 2 others, of radical candor, radical acceptance, and radical feedback. Right. In the sense of, for example, one of the things that we've implemented is we do a personal operating system for everyone that joins the team in Offsite. It's one of their onboarding tasks of filling in this document that's standardized of sort of what are your core values? What is the experience you hope to get out of this? What are you working on personally? And really you could share as much or as little as you want. You can share your social media if you want to. You don't have to, right? So, but encouraging radical candor from the very beginning of here's how I work best with people. Here's how I, what makes me me. Here's the best way to give me feedback, right? So radical candor, radical acceptance of, hey, my child just got kicked out of daycare for a tantrum. I need to go pick them up, right? We're in a fully remote world. Having acceptance of people's time zones when life is happening around them is an absolute requirement for that. And then radical feedback of, hey, I felt like I wasn't receiving the level of effort that I needed from you today. What was going on? Asking questions, asking things like that, but also getting that under, again, the candor and the acceptance also applies to you as the manager, right? Of I know I give Jared radical candor and radical feedback, and he gives me radical acceptance of that feedback, and then sometimes he'll push back, right? So it's a 2-way street with that, but it really hits on kind of what everyone's talking about, which it really does come down to communication and joy.
I think related to that, and sort of piggybacking off of what Jenny had said, you also have to understand where your team is in its own development, right? So thinking about, are you already an established team? I sort of go back to Tuckman's phases of group development. We often hear forming, storming, norming, performing. You have to understand where your organization or the team that you're trying to build culture around is at, so that you can deploy interventions appropriately, and not just assuming that people are on the same page about what that looks like. And that's going to look a little bit different as your organization goes through some of those phases. And your ways of onboarding, to Jenny's point about new employee orientation and that onboarding experience, you need to think about, are they joining a really established team? Are they joining something that's relatively new? For leaders, what does that look like? And so thinking about that culture is not something that you can just have a cookie cutter approach to, even once you have a good model, because your organization is going to continue to be dynamic. You're going to experience different things. We know staff turnover is real. We know different other kinds of challenges make things a little bit more difficult. And so thinking about, you want to constantly be fine tuning and adjusting that as you're working through your organizational life cycle.
So I want to see if we can take some of these basics, make it super practical just for a second, then we can zoom back out and talk about higher level stuff again. But I'd love to get a very practical example from each of you on how to apply some of these basics and fundamentals that we've been talking about. So Jenny, I heard you say icebreakers could be, something that you can deploy. What are your favorite icebreaker questions that you always revert back to that, someone can take away from this conversation? Feel free to start there. If you have any other like super practical takeaways on the basics, the 101s of company culture for remote and hybrid teams, especially, we could do that. And then Jake, Adam, if you want to jump in with anything, you have a lot to choose from in terms of the basics, the fundamentals, but yeah, give us some practical, takeaways real
Yeah,
quick,
absolutely.
if you don't
So
mind.
learning icebreakers, team building, this is like one of my areas of obsession. And so lots to choose from there. But one of the things I like to talk about, there's some people who you say icebreaker and they are like, yay. And other people are like, oh no, get me out of here right now. So I think to Adam's point about like meeting your group where they are, always think about, again, inviting those deeper layers of vulnerability without anyone feeling forced, right? Because forced vulnerability makes people close instead of open. And I love to think about, how do you give people a why? Like, why should I be engaging with this? What's in it for me? And to, again, make it appropriately vulnerable in a professional context. So one of the ways that you can do that is by cross-referencing the personal and professional. So some of my favorite icebreaker questions that do that is like, who's a mentor who has helped your career growth over the years, and like, how have they done that, right? So it's a little bit of emotional. There's some kind of past history, there's some humility, right? And someone who helped you along the way, what they gave you, what you learned. So we're not just like speaking from up high, but this is the path that I've been on, and what it's taken, and who's helped me in that path. Another question I really love is like, what's the worst job you've ever had and why? What's one of the, this has been a cool one for me, transition. I often have asked, like, what's one of the first jobs you had? Tell us about that. Because that's, again, a really interesting thing to find out, like, where you came from. But the piece that I've added onto it recently that I got from a workshop participant that I love is like, what's one of the first jobs you ever had, and how has that influenced your career path, or how has that influenced the leader that you become today? So I used to do a lot of customer service facing jobs, and now I realize how I'm so obsessed with customer service, and it's because I was on the receiving end when people would yell at me on the phone, and I was like, man, I'm a person, so I'm really up about that. And I just made that connection recently when someone asked. So again, these are ways that we can get insights into our colleagues, see where they came from, how they become who they are today, in a way that is both personal, right? It's delving into my life experience, but it's in that professional context. So I find it's easier to get people to buy in that regard. And I'll give you one more example of, so those are kind of icebreaker questions, but one of the activities I love, I use so much, it's called commonalities, and I do it in 3 phases. So the first one is you get people in small groups of 2 or 3. You give them 2 or 3 minutes. You ask them to find as many things as possible they have in common that they didn't know previously that are not obvious. So obvious would be like, we have blue eyes, I'm wearing a black shirt, we work for X company. So not obvious, like, I'm a middle child, I have 2 dogs, I hate eggplant, right? Those are not obvious things. So you're trying to find as many as possible. So it's both collaborative and competitive. So it's a little bit of a race concept of timing there. So at the end of the 3 minutes, you find out like what groups found how many things, and then kind of a brainstorm of what kind of things you found. Then I often like to combine groups. So groups of 2 become a group of 4. And in that group of 4, you find as many things that are different as possible. So now we're going through different things. So it might be you all have different shoe sizes, or you all have different horoscope signs, or you were all born in a different country. So you're looking for things that are all different. And it's easy to feel close to people when you find things that are in common. And the invitation is, let's also get curious and lean in when we find things that are different, and use that as a jumping off place to create deeper connection. So we do things that are different. Again, a couple minutes, we find out who found out what. And then in those same groups, we do a third round that it's a storytelling round. So storytelling is one of the fastest ways that you can create depths of connection and bonding between groups and teams. And so we ask you to, each group picks one of those categorical differences that they found. It's the country that you were born in, and you're going to tell us a story for about a minute about that country, where you came from, like what that was like growing up in that place, right? So it's a very seemingly simple thing, but then it gives you this deeper window into someone's world. And again, that empathy for where people have come from and what it's taken for them to get where they are today. So those are some icebreaker questions and one icebreaker activity that I really love that is very applicable in an adult professional context.
Hope you're taking notes, Jake, to share with our clients. You give us some practical takeaways from another part of the fundamentals stack of running a great company culture remotely or hybridly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I mentioned the personal operating system. I already have a prompt where if you that you can just copy and paste basically that and fit it to your business case. So if you want that, send me an email, jake@offsite.com. I'll be happy to send over that template so you can implement a version of that for your own company. That's a really key, easy takeaway for that. The other thing I would say that's a very practical way of running daily life is sort of if you were thinking through as a remote company, what part of the office do we want to emulate, right? What are the things that people miss, right? People miss the human connection. People miss the water cooler conversation sometimes, not always, right? But people miss sometimes like having background music when you walk in the door, right? It's very strange. You don't think about it. When you open your computer and you log into the office, there's no one to greet you, right? So creating a norm of a daily check-in. So for example, at Offsite, we use a tool called Geekbot that I love because it's a day for, it sends us a daily reminder for a daily stand-up of what did you work on yesterday? How are you feeling? What are you working on today? Any blockers? Something as simple as that. We all fill in. It's kind of like our good way of saying good morning to our team, but sometimes we'll be like, good morning, Geekbot. Here we go, right? So an easy way to greet your team every day, and the joy of saying good morning to someone during your first interaction, right? Setting those norms is a really easy thing to say there. And then the third thing of for me, being a background and musician, is also in like playlists of the day if people want to listen to it during their deep work setting. Sometimes they're work appropriate. Usually on Fridays, they're not as work appropriate. It's just sort of a fun way to send things that are just things to get people dancing in their chairs, get their brain moving in that way, spark the creativity out of that. But creating those norms where you're creating joy, I think is always a great practicality. Adam, over to you.
We actually do something pretty similar with some of our clients in terms of your personal operating system. We call it an interaction guide, but it also comes with sort of a reflection guide. And the questions are centered around, you get the worst of me when, you get the best of me when, what the best way to communicate or the best way to get me on board. And that way you start to learn aspects of each other and how you might want to interact. And more importantly, when you start setting company expectations, you start to know when somebody may have a different preference that is different than that expectation. So you can start to anticipate some of the potential reactions they may have, or if this person really loves to talk on the phone or jump on a video call, and this person really would prefer to keep the conversation on Slack, whatever your company culture is, what somebody's preference is. So if you're like, wow, this conversation's kind of difficult, you can look back at that interaction guide and be like, oh, they actually are better verbally than they are in writing. So maybe we can think about adjusting this particular conversation topic. Another sort of icebreaker activity that we do with a lot of organizations is called Soundtrack to Your Life. So essentially, each person identifies 3 songs that represent their past, 3 songs that represent their present, and 3 songs that represent their future. You put them on sort of a document. Those documents are distributed anonymously, and you kind of have to figure out who you got based on the songs that you're seeing. But then in a team meeting, you actually have to take a 30-second or 15-second clip of a song that you got from the list and try to connect it to your life in some way. Some people get really deep. Some people keep it relatively surface level. But it also then creates a song list that you can create for Spotify. And that way, if people want some of that background music, they know that it's a music selection that's curated by their peers within the organization. And that starts to, be a conversation point. So we have groups who will do this every quarter, every year, and they just continue to add, and that's sort of their playlist that they have. The other thing that I think people underestimate, which is interesting post-COVID, but use the technology that you have to replicate some of those in-person things that you're not getting anymore, right? So thinking about, there's no cost to adding channels to a Slack or a Teams. And so thinking about having those water cooler channels, a parents channel, employee resource group channels, let those people have spaces to interact in ways that maybe aren't necessarily totally work focused, but help sort of motivate them and to feel connected to their peers. I mean, research shows that people who have, Gallup Q12, people who have what they consider a best friend in the workplace are more likely to be retained. And so thinking about what are the ways in which you can build those connections and not be so hyper focused on this is a work tool that can only be used for project-based conversation, and just making sure that you're giving them those opportunities since they can't walk by each other in the hallway, they can't gather in the lunchroom, or they're not sort of walking out the door at the same time having some side conversation. Just encourage ways to facilitate that conversation. And some people like to take ownership over those communities. So it doesn't always necessarily have to be a top-down approach to managing those Slack channels. Different folks will, you have a music junkie, they want to have the what's on your playlist channel. So utilize your employees and their interests to help keep those different engagement opportunities going.
Yeah, we have Dogs of Offsite as a channel. We have Just for Fun, which is a general catch-all. We have a foodies channel. We have a book club channel, and we have a workout and wellness channel. So we're off to the races there. I do think we need an official music channel because otherwise Jake keeps sharing playlists in Just for Fun. And maybe people don't want to listen to Jake's music.
I've also seen, as I've been talking to people about, either running their offsites or even when they're running their like all company summits, right? When they're getting 500, 700, 1,000 people together, how to then create the bridge back and forth between the online and the in real life, right? So it's like have a moment during that summit where those kind of employee resource groups or those interest groups, like everyone who's on the dog channel, like we're meeting up here and we're going to go visit the ASPCA or whatever it is, you know what I mean? But just like having those moments where it's like, oh yeah, we've been having these wonderful connections online. Let's put faces to names and continue those conversations in person. And so I think they can go back and forth, right? But in some ways, we can start things online, but having those in-person touch points really does solidify, and then it continues in a much deeper and richer way. And then the other thing I was going to add to what you shared, Adam, was, because most of us are spending so much time virtually, especially remote and hybrid, right? This is your world, this is your office, this is your community. Platforms like this, whether it's Teams or Zoom, this, like, one of the main things I say to people is like breakout rooms, breakout rooms, breakout rooms. Like, it's so simple, but it's so powerful, right? Really getting people into those small groups. I always say, like, 1 is solo, 2 is a partnership, 3 is the smallest microcosm of community. So if you can have time in your meeting, in your stand up, whatever it is that you're doing, your all hands, put people in a breakout room in small groups and let them talk amongst themselves. All of a sudden, people are feeling connected, they're feeling human, they're feeling open, they're feeling receptive. And a little bit of connection goes a long way in terms of catalyzing whatever content you want to share, right? So it's like you put people in breakout rooms for 5 minutes, they come back, oh wow, now I'm here, I'm present, I'm ready, like let's go, I'm feeling more energized, and I maybe met some new colleagues I haven't met, or I'm deepening relationships with people I already know. And I've heard from a lot of teams that it's like, oh, the technology, and they don't know how to do the breakouts. And it's like, that's a small hurdle, but you got to get over that and then give people a chance to connect amongst each other rather than kind of one-way information dissemination or like top down where everyone just goes into passive observer, like listening mode, right? So it's like, how do you give people the opportunity? And I think breakout rooms are, these platforms are not meant for human connection. They're meant for information dissemination. So we have to find ways of hacking them to create that authentic human experience. And I think breakout rooms are one of the best ways and simplest ways to do that. So it's just giving people a simple question, having them go in there. I mean, you can do obviously much more in-depth prototyping and ideating and brainstorming as well, but just to, start your sessions with a little bit of human connection, I think goes a long way. And you can do that on these platforms. I've seen it work. I know 100%. I had my first, what is it? Like a baby shower kind of blessing way, I had on Zoom with like 20 amazing women from around the world, and it was so powerful. And I know for sure that you can create, establish, and maintain very healthy, vibrant relationships on platforms like this if you are intentional about it.
And I think to your point, Jenny, there are platforms that are meant for that, right? So you have like a gather round that allows you to have more engaging than just sort of the Zoom boxes, and lets you incorporate more tools and flashcards and music videos and all of the things. I also think like if you're stuck in sort of the Zoom world or the Teams world, there's interesting things you can do, right? So we did a whole week of on each day during a stand-up, people would change their Zoom background to be a movie set of a favorite TV show that they've had. So we had people who had the Brady Bunch. We had folks who had like really iconic sets, and the whole goal was you sort of had to guess where each person's was. And that started a lot of conversations, shared some commonalities, exposed people to new TV shows or movies. And so thinking about what are the features of your existing tech stack that maybe you're just taking for granted. Most people just sort of blur it a little bit or all the way, or do sort of the beach or the space. But how can you actually make it an extension of the activity or the meeting that you're in sort of more innovative ways?
Yeah. I love that too with the backgrounds. And it's like if we're doing a brainstorming session, that it's like, oh, put a background picture of somewhere that creates inspiration for you, or where you think big thoughts. Like, is it on the mountaintop, or sending everyone the same image that they're going to put on? So it's like, hey, here we are all on top of Mount Kilimanjaro, and we're going to envision the next like Q4 goals, or like what's possible here. So it's like you can use that. And one of the things I also love, especially on Zoom, is the screen name. So I say to people, like, you can put a nickname you've had in the past, you can put a place on your bucket list, you can put something in, a very short phrase or one or two words that can all of a sudden give you major insight and make you feel more connected to the person that you're looking at, just in the words on the screen. So it's like you got the words on the screen, you got the image in the background, all of a sudden now, wow, you're becoming a three-dimensional person, not just an anonymous image.
Love this. We will go to the big O word, Offsite, in just a moment. But the next conversation I wanted to have us go through is zooming out. So we got really practical. There's a lot of takeaways. Let us know in the chat what your favorite takeaway has been so far, the one that you're going to bring to your team today or tomorrow. We'd love that feedback. But yeah, if you zoom out, if you think about the future of work, and I've handed you a magic wand, perhaps we like make some sort of fun fairy background. But if you have a magic wand, you can architect the future of work. What do you think that should look like for as many companies and knowledge workers as possible? Adam, I'll let you go first. No pressure.
I think one of the things that I think about in terms of the future of work, we're obviously seeing a shift post-COVID of organizations asking people to come back to the workplace, either permanently or in a more hybrid fashion than a fully remote fashion. And I think one of the things that's not as intentional about that is thinking about, to some of the conversation already today, how do you have those two worlds feel seamless, right? So thinking about from a hardware perspective, how is it easy for somebody to pick up their work on their days in the office, as easy as it is to plug into their home office? So what does it look like to have sort of a tech stack that makes the logistics really easy? And then what does it look like to emulate some of the virtual spaces and the in-person spaces in both, right? So similar to we've talked about channels, activities, bringing some of those people together, depending on which modality you're moving to. But I also think what we're seeing, especially with companies that have really good culture, is they're open to the concept of a culture being built from the bottom up as well as top down, right? So I think back in the day, I was part of an ed tech startup. It was a lot of this is what we want for our organization, and sort of this is kind of what we envision, and we want people who want to join into that and be a part of that very specific way of being and that operational culture. And now I think organizations are being much more successful in saying, this is our vision, and let's co-create that together, and having individuals have more of an autonomous and leadership role in what culture looks like, right? And part of that is stemming from you want to have the best talent possible. And so putting people into boxes is not always going to help you recruit the best talent possible. But also from the standpoint of thinking about an equity lens, and different people need different things. And so at a base level, making sure that people's needs are met from, again, their tech stack, their sort of operating modems, but also then thinking about, a lot of times I see organizations center culture building around alcohol. Not everyone drinks. And so how do you make it okay to have the concept of it's a mocktail? It's not necessarily always have to be a cocktail. Not everyone has the ability to do something after the business hour. So we're going to do this social hour, this happy hour, but it's going to be at the end of the business day. Somebody may have to run and go pick up kids, or they just mentally need to check out because they're a super introvert. How do you make sure that you're sort of being accommodating for the differences of your staff? Because ultimately that's going to make them feel valued. That's going to make them feel engaged. And I don't think that customizing or being intentional that way has to mean high touch, high cost, super expensive, unwieldy to sort of manage that culture. Because again, the more people are buying in, the more they're willing to take part in building that culture. And so I think I see successful organizations moving toward more of a co-creation model in terms of their culture building.
Yeah. I think you always hear we have to go back to the office for the culture, right? In the sense of the office is the culture, right? And they are synonymous of being in an office equals having a culture, right? I think it's sort of the opposite for me, right? Of the culture is the people, the culture is the excitement, and that could be at an office, could be at an offsite, it could be anywhere, right? But I think that there are some jobs where being in an office is needed, right? Like being a nurse, you have to kind of be in person to do most of those nursing roles. Or being an engineer at, say, I don't know, Apple, right? Or even something like Peloton, right? You have to physically work on hardware. That's easier to do and collaborate in person, right? But that doesn't mean that everybody in the company needs to do that, right? Because I have another friend that works in sales for a Fortune 100, and being on the sales floor for them is chaos. They can't get any work done because everyone's talking around them. They can barely hear what's on their own phone call. And so it doesn't work for everybody. I feel like we've reached the point where everyone's trying to put the pieces back together of like pre-COVID in a way, but like it's been 4.5 years now, right? And even before COVID, this change was happening, right? Because I work better from my home. But if I were to be paid stupid money to go in an office, sure, but you're paying my commuting stipend then, you know? So I think that what I would really challenge companies to do when it comes to thinking through the future of work is, what does success look like to you? First, answer that question first. What does successful company, successful employee look like for you? And then answer the question, do they have to be in an office for that? Yes or no? Right? We've seen that customer service teams can work very effectively, fully remotely. Apple's been doing it for years, even before COVID, right? So using that approach of, number one, what does success look like? Then figuring out where do they need to be to do that job, right? And if the answer is not in an office, then let it be not an office. Or if those people want to go into an office, great. But I think for them, you have to first define the why, then the what, then the how.
All right, Jenny, you've co-created something as magical as acro yoga, so I'm expecting big answer here.
Oh my.
You get a magic wand on the future of work.
Pressure. It's an interesting, like, what do we think is going to happen, or what do we like wish to happen? And I do think I think as both of you have spoken to, there's a combination of like individual agency and freedom that we all want now. And we're not willing to be told what and where to be and how to do all the things. So I think you got to think about providing agency and freedom for individuals, right, to live their lives and take their personal lives into account. I think people are still prioritizing work, but they recognize that their personal lives, their health, and their families are equally as important. So how to create time and space for that. And at the same time, we do need some sense of connection, some sense of purpose, some connection to the greater whole of the company, the organization, and the coworkers that we have. So I think having kind of, maybe this is our segue into offsites, but having some regular in-person touch points is really important that people can rely on, right? So they know with their team once a quarter or once every half year or every year, at least there's an annual touch point where it's like, I know I'm going to see the people that I work with, the people that I care about, and deepen relationships. And I've seen a lot of offsites now also being project-based, right? So you're doing a kickoff for a new project. Let's bring these cross-functional teams together to do that deep work in person. So also thinking about what is the work that can be best done independently at home, and what is the work I think that we've spoken about that really benefits from being in person together for extended periods of time is, I think, really important to think about and talk about. And there was one more thing I wanted to say about future of work, independent and together. It's not coming to me right now, but it's there. I will come back to it if it resurfaces. But I think, yeah, having a mix of, oh, this is what I was going to say. So many offices, and I've been in touch with the folks at Airbnb in San Francisco, they have an amazing office space, but most offices are now transforming from office spaces where people come independently to get work done to event venues where people are coming together to collaborate, to ideate, to do team building offsites and things like that. So that's, I think, one of the transitions that we're going to continue seeing is how office space is being reinvented. We already went from those individual cubicles to more of like open space, but that was open space with still individual working. And I think now we're seeing much more conference rooms, event venues, places where people can come and gather as a group or team and do their most deep and important work together, and how to make that space feel special, feel unique, feel rejuvenating, feel inspiring, right? It can't just be like Berber carpets and fluorescent lights, right? We have to bring in plants, bring in ways to make the office actually be a fun treat, like a fun, invigorating place to go instead of like a soul-sucking, sterile place to be. So I think that's part of the transition we're going to continue seeing, as well as, of course, like reduced office space, but then really reinventing the way that those office spaces are used.
And we've made it to the part of the evening where everyone has been waiting for. We're going to talk about offsites because that's what we do at offsite.com. We plan team retreats and offsites. And I started the company in part because I was fortunate enough to work remotely 13 years ago for a company called 15.5. Got to attend their offsites as a remote first employee, and then saw the shift to more remote and hybrid work over the decade between being at 15.5 and the start of the pandemic. And if you looked at all the pioneering remote first companies like Automatic, which owns WordPress, or GitLab or Zapier or Buffer or 15.5, they all planned offsites because they decided that they wanted to have in-person, intentional experiences whereby their team can establish trust and intimacy, deepen their pre-existing relationships, and then leverage that to solve pressing problems in their companies, save the world, all the things we do in tech and that you do in your day-to-day work. And so we have a company around that. It's really cool that like Automatic's now one of our investors, and like Buffer's a client and 15.5's a client. But nevertheless, I would love to hear everyone's ideas on how to run a great offsite. And you can briefly speak to some of the importance of offsites for remote and hybrid companies in particular. Jake, I'll let you wrap up. Maybe we'll go Jenny, Adam, and Jake. And then after we hear from everyone, we'll do 5 or so minutes of Q&A. And then we'll let you guys give some parting thoughts, and we'll end on the hour, if not a few minutes early. So let's sprint to the finish. Jenny, what do you got for us in terms of offsites?
Offsites, yeah. One of my passion projects and things I do oftentimes with clients is help them design the flow of their offsite, and then also go in and facilitate, especially the team building, culture building sections. But one of the things I find with offsites is without kind of proper training or frameworks, offsites end up becoming just this checklist of things that we think we need to address. And again, often becomes very like 80% kind of information dissemination or one-way PowerPoints as opposed to collaborative learning and brainstorming. So I think really one of the main things you can do is look at your offsite and say, like, what are the things that really benefit from being done live in person as a group for an extended period of time. And that's going to eliminate a lot of the things you would normally do in the day-to-day work or in a 1-hour meeting. Anything that can be done well virtually, anything that can be done well asynchronously should not be done at your offsite. So you really have to optimize for that live in-person group extended time experience. And I think that really starts to shift what your agenda is going to look like. So that's one piece. And then not only that, but thinking about the sequencing of how you're layering the activities together, because you can have all the right ingredients and in the wrong order, like your souffle is just going to be mush, right? It's not going to have the effect that you want. So I like to think of 3 basic components and in this order. So the first one, as we talked about earlier, is like connecting early because it creates that psychological safety and sets the foundation for high performing teams. So do that team bonding, that team connection at the beginning. A lot of people want to start with the logistics. They want to start with updates. They want to start with briefings. They want to start with like big agenda for the next 4 days. It's like, we don't need that. What we need is to feel human. We need to feel connected so that we can do all those things effectively. So start with your team bonding session, whether that's like, you know, a 20-minute icebreaker or a 2-hour team bonding session. So start with that to set that foundation of trust, rapport, and safety. And then I would go into whatever kind of like upskilling you need for your team. So we have an event we're doing, Jared's involved with it, Offsite's involved with it next month, called Offsite for Offsites. So it's this meta experience about offsites. And one of the workshops that we're bringing in is how to make better, faster decisions as a team, right? What is that skill? Is it feedback? Is it collaboration that your team needs to do their jobs more effectively? Because everyone wants to grow and learn, right? We want to feel like we're excelling in our roles. So I think doing some of that inspiring skill building seminar for the group that you're with to help them do their jobs better. And then the third piece is doing that deep strategic work, right? So if you think about that meeting concept, like what are the big hairy problems? What are the difficult conversations? What is the innovation that's needed for the team or the company that you need 3 or 4 hours or 2 days to really get into, because otherwise it's not going to happen piecemeal. So those are some of the things I would think about in terms of structuring your offsite and making the most of it. And the last thing I'll say, because this is one of the things I share often, and people are like, oh my God, that changed the way I thought about this. And you can use this for any kind of event or program at all. Training is what I call the primary shift. And the primary shift is a from to statement. So you're thinking about what is the main change that I want to create for this group or team in this period of time? And then you could say, is that shift realistic? So most of the time we think about the 2, we think about the goals. We want to create more authentic connection. We want to end up with our revised version of our values, right? What is that too? But you have to think about what the from is, like, where are we starting from? Maybe we don't have any values already written, or maybe we have some that are there, but we need to tweak some. How are we going to get the input? Is it realistic that in 2 days we'll be able to revise our company values, get everyone's input, and feel like people are bought in? So what is that from to statement? Could be as simple as from confused to clear. There's been a big reorg. Nobody knows who's doing what, right? So maybe that's the simple thing. Or maybe it's we're going from a toxic drama culture to feeling safe to be vulnerable with my colleagues. So what is that from to? And when you have that from to, it really creates a very clear arc of transformation, a theory of change that you need to, that you can operationalize and say, okay, how are we going to achieve that in the time that we have? So thinking about where's the group starting out at, where do I want to take them to? And then how do I create a dynamic, engaging curriculum that asks people to be participants and contributors that they're involved in actively? And that can we get there in that amount of time? Because ideally you want to over deliver rather than over promise and under deliver, which makes people feel demoralized, right? So how do we walk away feeling like, yeah, we really nailed that and hit that out of the park? And then that excitement and inspiration continues as you go back into the day-to-day. So a couple things, hope that wasn't too much. I'm passionate about this topic.
I love how passionate you are about it. I'm really excited to check out the event in October. Feel free to put the details in the chat if you want.
Yeah, we'll do.
Adam, go for it.
I couldn't agree more with your comments, Jenny, around the concept of, we hear a lot, this meeting could have been an email. This offsite shouldn't have been able to have been a Zoom meeting. You want to do things that you can't do in your normal infrastructure. And so part of that, I'm a tech person, I love tech, but when I think about an offsite, I think about how can you limit the amount that people are on devices or utilizing sort of more of some of the digital pieces. So how can you have, instead of, we're going to all go into the same shared document, how can we have a whiteboard? Instead of taking notes in terms of a parking lot for things to talk about later on a shared piece of paper, can you have cards? So, people do really well with sort of kinesthetic or tactile materials, and thinking about, if you're asking people to take the time to be in the same space, how can we make sure that they're in the same experience? We know as soon as we all bring up our phones, our tablets, or our laptops, the email dings start going off, the reminders, the Asana task list, all of those different things. And how can you take people out of that and be okay with having, so when my team does offsites, it's a no response time. We put our out of offices up. People should not be expecting to continue to do their daily operations in the middle of that, because you're pulling them out of that experience. Also, how can you think about more ways than just having a brainstorm around a hollow square or a table, right? So how can we do simulations? How can we do tabletop exercises? How can we really make people feel like they're immersed in these activities? And again, it's not just another meeting that could have happened in another format. Part of that also means that some people, depending on who your offsite is for, should not be holding multiple roles as part of that offsite. So often we see somebody who's supposed to be a contributor is also the person who arranged the food with the catering. And then when it's time to set up the meal, they're absent because they're trying to wrangle all of that. And they're missing a part of the conversation or the bonding experience. So how can you make sure that you're setting up all participants for success by giving them the latitude to be able to do that? Whether that's hiring external facilitators or working with a facility that has catering, but really thinking about, if you want your people to get the most out of this, they've got to be able to be present. And so again, making sure they're not holding multiple roles. But it's okay to also think about, what expertise can you leverage within your team and have them bring. So to Jenny's point about upskilling, you may have somebody who really is a rock star in a particular area, and they have a skill set that other folks can learn from, or they have formal education or training or certifications. And how can you utilize the own strengths within your team to help and complement it with other things that you may be bringing in? I think a lot of times we think about these offsites too logistically, and we don't think about them as experiences in the same way that we would as sort of facilitators, right? So really making sure that folks understand that I'm not just coming to an in-person meeting, I'm coming to an experience that my organization's trying to host for me. And it's just going to get you a lot more buy-in from folks.
All right,
Yeah,
Jake, I know you have a lot on this subject, but we need like
I'll,
3
I'll
full
keep
minutes
it
to
brief
talk.
because you both took some of my favorite things. Number one, what are things that you cannot do over Zoom? Number two, start with the why. Like, why are we getting people together there? And then the important thing to me is, in education land, I'm sure you all have heard this, if you've worked in education, was the acronym SWABOT, right? It was students will be able to. The reason why your teacher would always start with the lesson with that is, by the end of this class, you will be able to do blank, 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 is because it allows the human brain to turn off, like, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And just actually go towards that goal. So I always start every session with, hey, by the end of the session, we hope to accomplish X, Y, Z, right? And making sure people understand the goal, especially if you have a backwards way of getting there, letting people know what the kind of the prompt is there. The last thing I strongly recommend to all of our clients to do is to schedule the day like high school. 45-minute class, 15-minute passing period, because we're used to 30-minute meetings now on Zoom, right? That's kind of where the calendar blocks are. And so asking people to stay in one brain mode for 2 hours is just really hard for a lot of people now. People have to use the restroom, you need to move, you need to stand, you need to do this thing. So I usually recommend a 45-minute max session with a 15-minute break, because also there's a lot of joy that happens in the breaks, the conversations, the people will continue the conversations naturally. So just kind of include that as part of your offsite planning. If you want any more of these tips, feel free to schedule some time with any of us to kind of chat through those things. But I think that leads us to our Q&A section, and I don't see anything in the chat. So I know that everyone here probably has one question or one piece of advice that they maybe want to bring to the table. So what questions do you have?
Feel free to unmute, come on video, ask away.
I'm also not afraid to call on people. So I will do that if we have an awkward silence here. All right, I'm gonna call on someone. Chris, do you have any questions? Cool.
Chris, mute. No. Any questions at all? Live audience? Going once, going twice.
Say, hearing none. Appreciate everyone's time today. Oh wait, we gotta.
Chris
Oh,
said you can't hear me. Do you wanna type your question in the chat? And then we'll do Chris's question, and then we'll if there is one, and then we'll just do sort of quick. Where can we learn more about you all? Where Jenny shared the event coming up, but would love to hear sort of next steps to learn more about you, Jenny, especially for people that didn't join us live. Same with Adam and then Jake, of course. Chris wants to know more about Jenny's icebreakers. So I think we got a few example icebreakers earlier. So feel free to interpret that question however you want and share more details or more examples or
Yeah. So Chris, I'll share with you. It's a little bit awkward right now because we're in the middle of a brand transition, a website transition, but in the next like day or two, if you go to playonpurpose.com, and I'll drop it in the chat, that's where I have a library of over 80 in-person and virtual team building games and icebreakers that are designed for a professional adult audience. I've been leading these games for 10 or 20 years. I know that they work. It's very detailed video tutorials, so it's very easy to learn them today and lead them tomorrow. Even if you're not a very experienced facilitator, they kind of lead themselves. So they're designed for connection and engagement specifically. And there's lots of cool modalities in there, like writing and drawing and movement and storytelling and all kinds of innovative things that your teams probably haven't seen before. So I'll drop it in the chat, and you just become a member there, and then you get access to everything right away. And it's a great resource. And that will then sometime soon in the next few days, redirect you to our new website, which is called The Primary Shift, which is our main, my main consulting and training organization that's adjacent to the Culture Conference. So I'll drop that in the chat also, so you can reach me. I will pop my email in there as well.
awesome. Is there any other final parting words? And then maybe we'll give it to Adam and Jake.
I'm as you've heard me talk, connection 1,000 times. I cannot beat that drum strongly enough, and just having it be intentional, having it be strategic, and then creating these, what I call like micro moments of connection, right? It doesn't have to be a 2-hour team building workshop every time you get together, but just having those moments for people to establish that trust and rapport, to feel human, to feel vulnerable, to feel open, I think really does impact people's connection to the purpose, to the values, their commitment to the team, to the success of the organization makes a huge difference. So that would just be some parting words that I would wish for all the teams and companies you work with.
Thank you. Adam, take it away. Where can we learn more about you?
Yeah, so folks are welcome to reach out on LinkedIn, or I'll put my information in the chat, but it's just adam@t.f.com or www.t.f.com in case you're interested in learning about any of our training, group development, executive coaching. In terms of final thoughts, one of the things that I'll say is when you're thinking about the resources that you would commit for an offsite, make sure that you're centering it around the people. So often we want to start to think about well, we can do this meeting or this deadline's coming up, and it gets too focused on projects or process, and really recentering the way that you think about an offsite or a retreat or building culture around people, and thinking about if you're going to approach that with intentionality, like we've talked about the whole time, and putting people first, you're not going to go wrong with bringing people together in a group in the same space. Especially if they're remote or hybrid team, that's only going to solidify those bonds and those relationships. And even thinking about if you're a brick and mortar organization, there's something to be said about going to a different space to encourage different thought that gets you out of your daily norms and out of your habits and the ways that you're typically doing things, And so just really keep an open mind about what can happen, and it's okay to have fun, right? And that it's okay to sort of allow folks to be a little bit more personable, allow them to sort of share more openly, and just give folks an opportunity to really engage and encourage it and make sure it's a safe space for them to be able to do that.
Thank you. Jake, what do you got to say for yourself?
Everyone always talks about like, oh my gosh, an offsite is so much money. It's so expensive. It's such, and they view it as a cost instead of a resource, right? But we would have never had said, oh my gosh, this office is too much money, right? You have to, if you are a fully remote company, planning an offsite is a key to success for your organization. It is essential, basically. So as you're looking at the costs and thinking through this, you need to be thinking through not only what is the joy and the gain we're going to get out of this, but also the actual takeaways that we're going to have, right? But also make sure you're budgeting enough money for everyone's room and board. Make sure you're budgeting enough for flights. Make sure you're budgeting enough for things to make this accessible, right? So if no one has grandma to watch the kids, right? How do you help pay for childcare for people that aren't there? How do you make this as exciting, like Adam mentioned, that's not centered around alcohol, right? How do you still make it where it's accessible in every way, shape, and form? And just kind of keep that in mind as you're planning. And also my last piece of wisdom is start at least months earlier in advance than you normally think you would. I recommend 1 month for every 10 people, right? So if you have 60 people, you need to be planning at least 6 months in advance, if for no other reason than just to get it on people's calendars and they can plan around it. If you're planning an offsite in 8 days or less, you are probably going to be struggling at that experience. So give yourselves as much time as you can. You connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email, jake@offsite.com. Really appreciate everyone joining today. Jared, back to you.
We're ending on time, so thank you for everyone that joined live. If you watched this, asynchronously, then let us know as well. Jared@offsite.com, offsite.com, if you just want to go to the site directly. And thank you again to Jake, to Adam, and to Jenny.
Thanks for hosting us,
Thanks,
Jake.
everybody.
Yeah.